So thank you for everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm Stephanie Cronin. I'm the Executive Director of the Middlesex 3 Coalition. We are a public-private partnership, a regional economic development organization. We represent 10 municipalities, and about 140 or so are the larger businesses in the region, the educational institutions, the real estate stakeholders, the companies working together as a coalition to improve economic development and business development in the region. This is our our third out of four panels that we've been doing, webinars that we've been doing with the New England Real Estate Journal. It was supposed to be an in-person meeting that we've changed to a 4-week webinar series. I'm looking forward to today's, if we can stop there for just a second. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of movement on attracting life science companies to the region. COVID-19 certainly has an impact on this, as well as everything going on. But it wasn't until we had a prep meeting with the panel earlier this week that I had a better understanding on really the impacts, the details, the opportunities, the future growth, really what we can do as a region to be better prepared to attract the life science companies and what they need. So I look forward to today's panel discussions, and I thank our panel, I think our moderator. Obviously, life science is such a hot issue that I'm looking forward to today's discussion. So first, let me introduce our panel and thank our panel, starting with our moderator, Scott Weiss from the Gutierrez Company, as well as Robert Buckley from Reamer and Braunstein, Kristin Caster from the town of Burlington, Jay Sturdivant from Merlin Construction, and Sandia Iyer from the town of Lexington. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Before we get to that, hopefully around 11:15 or whenever Scott feels best, we're going to hopefully have time for Q&A. And to do that, I ask at the bottom of the screen, you can do one of three things. You can either raise your hand and we will unmute you. You won't be on screen, but you'll be able to talk. And we'll call on you, or you can write a question in the chat box, or you can write a question in Q&A. All the same. And then we'll read those questions. So with that, before we get into the panel, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Kaplan from the New England Real Estate Journal. All yours, Rick.
Good. How are you, Stephanie?
Doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I also want to thank the Middlesex 3 Coalition for all they do for the region, as well as being partners with the New England Real Estate Journal. We couldn't ask for better partners. And we put on this event every year, and it's always a fantastic event. It always proves to be well done. Today I want to thank all our sponsors, because we couldn't do this without them. It's corporate sponsors, Reamer and Braunstein, the BSC Group, Mogul Architects, our vendor sponsors, National Grid, Merlin Construction, EBI Consulting, and US Pavement. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is Scott Weiss. He is the Vice President of Development for Gutierrez. Is Gutierrez real estate?
Yep. Gutierrez is a Burlington-based, Massachusetts focused real estate and construction and property management company.
Okay, and that helps me with your introduction. You finished it for me.
Great.
So I wanted to introduce Scott Weiss, the Gutierrez Company.
Thanks, Rick.
Take it away, Scott.
Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Thanks, Rick and Stephanie, Aaron and Steph Britz for putting this together and putting together a great panel. As Steph and Rick kind of alluded to, certainly when we're in the midst of a pandemic, the topic of life sciences is on the forefront of everybody's mind. But if life science has not been on the forefront of anyone involved in real estate development, property management or any related activities in Massachusetts for the last probably 10 to 20 years, but certainly the last 5 to 10, huge focus, then you haven't been paying attention or reading the newspapers or looking online for anything, because it is a huge market in the Massachusetts area, and certainly Cambridge focused. But that does not mean that places like Middlesex 3 are left out. So I was going to give a brief overview from a little bit of our perspective, and then get right into the panel. I'll let each panelist talk about where they're at and how they're interacting with the life science industry. And then we can get right into some questions and look forward to everyone's feedback and input. So I'm going to try something. I'm not sure if I can do, Aaron, Stephanie, I'm going to try to share my screen so I can just run through a couple of slides that I threw together, albeit very quickly. So hopefully there aren't too many mistakes. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. Is that something that you can let me do, Aaron or Steph?
I'm hitting it right now. Let's see. Try now.
Okay. Should have been something that I probably cleared beforehand, huh?
It's okay. There we go.
All right. Excellent. Okay. So, oops. There we go. Okay. So, future of real estate development, life science. Pretty straightforward. Just a little background about Gutierrez Company. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we are a Burlington-based real estate development, acquisition, property management, and construction company. We had some clients and tenants in our buildings with some life science work prior to this, but in around 2015, we got engaged with the Millipore project, at the time EMD Millipore, now Millipore Sigma, in Burlington, Massachusetts, a 350,000 square foot life science research R&D facility that we developed and constructed for them at that time, completed in 2017. So a very large facility, a combination of office, lab, R&D space. This is a true life science lab building. And since that time, we've actually engaged. We have several other projects underway, some of which we're hoping to announce in the very near future. So that'll be a good thing for the region as well. But as we look forward toward some of the work that we were doing, it's one thing to build for a specific client and to meet their specific needs. One of the things that we engaged in was the Burlington Biocenter, which is a 100,000 square foot building that we delivered initially as an office building and then completely renovated to make lab life science ready. And so that is for anyone involved in the industry, there's a huge difference between an office building and a lab building. In order to accommodate the air exchange, the electricity, the water service, treatment for all of these facilities, there's a large amount of infrastructure that goes into delivering a building. And when we looked to convert this building to be ready for lab use, we really needed to look at the industry-wide best practices. What are the needs of the industry, so that we could be both prepared to respond to any tenant's requirements, have the flexibility, but also have the infrastructure in place for this building. So that building is actually done and ready for occupancy, and also happy to say we have a lot of interest that was developing prior to the onset of the pandemic. That, as I think Brent had mentioned, the life science industry has continued to remain active and stronger than most other real estate markets, even through the COVID-19 crisis. We also have another building also in Burlington, the Nexus at 43 South Avenue, also intended to be lab and life science ready. So we have a number of projects that we're working on currently, some that I mentioned here that are available, but we've been very deep into life science for half a dozen years now, and working through this. As I mentioned, if you're not paying attention to the news, maybe you're not aware, but Boston Cambridge market is considered the #1 market for life science throughout the country, and many will say in the world, the #1 area. And most people talk about it as Cambridge and Kendall Square focused, which is certainly the case, but the market is Massachusetts wide. And when you look at Boston, Cambridge versus some of the other cities listed around the country, you would put the city of Chicago and lay it over geographically over Boston area, and it would encompass all the way out past 128 and into the suburbs beyond. So when you look at the life science market here, it is a broad market, and Burlington or Tewksbury or Billerica are really part of the Massachusetts, Boston, Cambridge life science market. I'm sure Sandhya will be able to talk about this, having been formerly with Massachusetts Life Science Center, but there's a number of reasons that the Massachusetts market is considered and has maintained that #1 position from the level of investment, both from public NIH type sources as well as venture capital, the amount of schools and hospitals that are in the area, and the hospitals are research hospitals. I think I've seen 5 of the top 7 research hospitals for NIH funding are in Boston, which is a huge factor in helping us to keep and maintain the position that we're in from a region. And looking at the MassBio, if anybody wants some good statistics for where we're at in terms of the market, go to the MassBio website, Massachusetts Biotech Council. They have a tremendous amount of information about the biotech industry, which overlaps with life science and is encompassed within life science. I think when we talk about life science, and I know we'll get into this a little bit more, it encompasses so many different aspects of the both technology and medicine and pharmaceuticals. It incorporates AI, bioinformatics, it's medical devices, it's a number of different things. MassBio really focuses on the biopharma side, which is also very lab intensive. And as I mentioned, the market and the stretch of MassBio and life science in Massachusetts is more than just Boston, Cambridge. It encompasses the entire state and overflows into Rhode Island and New Hampshire as well. Employment has continued to grow, and the effect of that employment has been tremendous as well. Notable here, obviously, the average annual wage in the industry is based on 2018 numbers, over $160,000 a year, and that's the average. It is a very high-paying wage industry. Tremendous amount of growth in space over the 10 years, adding over 12.4 million square feet of lab space, which not all of that can happen in the Cambridge market. And so we've seen growth already in the suburbs and in Middlesex 3, and we are continuing to see that growth as well. As I mentioned, the not only NIH funding, the venture capital funding has been tremendous, $4.8 billion in 2018. And I know that's continued to grow into 2019, and even more so now during the pandemic. There's been tremendous investment in companies that have a local presence, such as Moderna and others as well. And it's important to understand that the amount of work and investigation that gets to this 27 candidate drugs, medicines looking for FDA approval starts with over 1,000 preclinical trials. And that's really important to understand on two fronts: the length of time it takes, from 2 to 8 years, just once a drug gets to a clinical trial stage, to get to the level where it can be developed, manufactured, and broadly distributed. But there's steps along the way where those medicines do have to be made for trials, for phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, where there's efforts where it's not small amounts in terms of 1 or 2 doses. You're still making maybe tens of thousands of doses, but you're not making millions, or when we're talking about vaccines, billions of doses. So it's important to understand how that plays into the market as well. And then, of course, it's been in the news why it's so important. And even as of yesterday, density concerns have lab tenants looking beyond Kendall Square, due to the pandemic and the concerns everybody is talking about whether or not Kendall Square is the right place. Maybe there's a split real estate solution where you have some workers in a more dense environment, but also looking to, more suburban, less dense locations. Hitting our sponsor or our supporter for this, the Real Estate Journal, and their article, and the work that Kristin had done in terms of advancing the Burlington effort, as well as some of the recent work where there are 57 life science companies are currently and still during the pandemic in the market for over 1.8 million square feet of new space. And of course, Massachusetts has been in the forefront of the worldwide fight against coronavirus. So with that, I'll stop. I will stop sharing the screen. I will let each panelist of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves and go through. Why don't we start with you, Sandhya, and talk a little bit about your current role and your interaction with the life science industry.
Hi, most of you. If you don't know me from my previous position, I now am the Economic Development Director for the town of Lexington. In my current position, it's similar to what I was doing, attracting more companies to come to the region, attracting more life sciences companies to come to the region. There are several projects, as Scott mentioned, and earlier during the discussion as well, that are lab ready, life sciences ready in Lexington as well. And we are trying to attract more companies to come forward to look at those developments, the life sciences or lab ready developments. Prior to joining the town of Lexington, I was with the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center as an associate director for business development, attracting a lot of life sciences companies from all across the world. In fact, this morning I was thinking about bio because it's the week of bio, and this is the first time I'm missing bio, even though it's virtual this year. So definitely a very apt topic to be that we need to raise during this time is how we can attract all of these life sciences companies, not just from a perspective of Cambridge and Boston, but also from all across the world to look at this region and the growth that this region can actually have in the coming years.
Terrific. Thank you, Sandhya. And just going the way the boxes are arranged on my screen. Hey, Bob, how about yourself? We know you're a permitting financing expert and have a lot of history in the life science world, writing the rules that let us build these buildings.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting ride. I think first of all, Riemann Bronstein is a multi-purpose, so multifaceted law firm with our main office in Boston. We have New York, Chicago, Miami, and Burlington. We do all our real estate development out of Burlington. We've been active probably for the last decade in a lot of life science construction and permitting. We've done projects in Lexington, the old Shire, and now Takata, and the old Cubis Pharmaceuticals, and Woburn, involved with some of Scott's projects here in Burlington. Did about 1 million square feet in Marlboro that has as part of its tenant-based Quest Diagnostics. But we've been very proactive in working with municipalities to try to get the municipalities to think progressively as to where the industry is going and to position themselves to take advantage of it. I know Kristin will probably get into this a little later, but I think Burlington is one of the stellar examples of being proactive and putting in place the rules and regulations that make these industries or these users take note of the fact that this might be a place where they can locate and grow. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jay.
My name is Jay Sturdivant. I am a project executive of the life science group at Merlin Construction. We have done many life science projects. We are a full service construction manager. But our focus here today is on life science. So we'll talk about that. Our current large projects we're involved in would be EMD Serrano and Billerica, a large project going on there. We also are in the middle of putting together a project with Boylston Properties in Watertown, which will be a life science building similar to the one you were talking about in Burlington. And we have done many large and small projects all over the 128 area, Genosco and several others. And my particular focus after 30 years of life sciences, there's not much I haven't done, from vivariums all the way up to medical facilities and that type of stuff, and full service on the medical life science.
Thank you. And Kristin.
So I'm Kristin Caster, Planning Director in Burlington. I've been there, I think I'm over a little more than 17 years now in Burlington. So there's been definitely a couple different waves. I just came in right after the 1990s kind of tech wave with Sun and Oracle. And Bob, I know you were part of that. In 2000s and 2010s, it was kind of amenity mixed use. And then 2020, we kind of looked around and said, okay, where we late 2000 put a biotech definitions in our bylaw and thought that, oh, we said biotech, maybe they'll come. And then took a look at our zoning and said, okay, well, we're really not looking at biotech and lab type spaces. And what do we have in Burlington? We have, 17 million plus square feet of space in Burlington, and not much of it is suited to lab, other than Millipore Sigma coming in with 350,000 square feet. So one of the initiatives that we really took on in 2018 and 19 was to do a big educational campaign and gather community consensus and put together panelists, which a panel of local folks as well as our partners and real estate brokers to really continue to educate from within as well as outside to really what this industry is, what we need to change, and to really start to attract life science where we felt that we really put in place the network, the mixed use, the amenities. And, we were saying, why are they going to Watertown and Framingham and Bedford? And Bedford was a real rub because we love Bedford, but it was, oh, well, we have, Northwest Park and 3rd Ave. And we were like, well, that's in Burlington. So anyway, it was really from our perspective, all of us, every single person on this call and people are listening, we're all part of this. We're all a team. And, as Bob, you say, everything is interrelated because I think we all need to work together, and these partnerships have really been what has made, I think, this industry come in to Burlington, around Burlington, in other industries that I don't want to get into, but we're between robotics, as Scott mentioned additive manufacturing, 3D printing, data security, and as well as what Scott, you were saying was, life science isn't just life science. Burlington has a strong software data security platform. Where does that go with medical data and life science? And how do these different companies come into life science and kind of all work together? So I think that's really what we're looking at from a municipal role, and trying to get consensus among the decision makers to make sure what we're putting in for regulation matches what you guys are looking for in terms of building type, building size, and simple things such as parking and FAR, but really make a huge difference, as well as kind of a predictable process and a clear defined channel and partnership with the Board of Health, and our Board of Health. So anyway, that's kind of what our role is, I think, and from a local perspective, but it's really comfort level, control, making, the community comfortable with life science. So life science is, a friendly addition to Burlington.
Can I add something to what Kristin just said, which I think she should take some credit for the town, which is that this area between the University of Lowell and Northeastern and other entities, there's been a real vibrant innovation subculture being developed here, which spawns life science research and development and ventures that are the seeds for the future. And I know Burlington and some of the communities in the Middlesex 3 Coalition have been very proactive, working with the various universities to encourage and nurture that and make the process welcoming. So that's the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Bob. And I think one of the things that Kristin, you mentioned that I also want to follow up on is, you were talking about what the town has done to make itself more attractive to the life science companies. And I know, Sandhya, you've had activity in trying to bring life science companies to Massachusetts and certainly now Lexington. But Jay, you've worked with a lot of these groups in the past on construction projects. What is different about a life science company and what their needs and requirements are, and how does that differ across the sort of geographic spectrum when you're talking about a lab in Cambridge versus what you're doing in with EMD Serono in Billerica, or how are those needs different? Why do you see or hear companies locating in one location versus out in the burbs?
So what we're seeing, and what seems to be the most recent model, is a lot of, we're all fighting, when you think about the life science group, it is a small community, and we're all basically fighting for the same employees is kind of what it comes down to. So the attraction in what companies are trying to do is they're trying to come up with a facility that basically will attract employees. So when we do these surveys on millennials and things like that, what's really important to them are the amenities and the actual space they're going to be working in. So when we think about it today, as opposed to back in the day when I first started, every lab looked the same. You had a research bench, a workstation, research bench, workstation. Nobody really cared about windows and interaction, right? Because really it was all about the science. And what we're seeing now is it's more about collaboration. And of course, COVID-19 is going to throw a little wrench in all this, but all of the designs are heading towards a more collaborative atmosphere. Lots and lots of glass, able to see what's going on in labs, able to see outside is a big one. A lot of people able to go outside the lab area, sit down with your colleagues and collaborate. And that collaboration isn't necessarily just about sitting in a conference room talking to the 5 of us. It may be sitting in the conference room talking to our colleagues in Cambridge or London or any other part of the country or internationally. And we need to have those technical needs also. So a lot of this is bringing in things like you mentioned, artificial intelligence, IT, and also making the surroundings pleasant so people really want to work there and enjoy it. And when you go into these campus type facilities, we're talking about cafeteria, grab and grows, cafes, coffee shops, and essentially what we call huddle spaces where you can move around the furniture any way you want, but you also have access to lots of IT, and you can get people into your group pretty easily. Like most of us would have said, what's Zoom before about, 12 weeks ago. Now we're all experts, right?
Right.
That's kind of the thing we've seen and the direction we're seeing from our perspective.
Scott, can I comment on what Jay just said? I think it was a very salient point where he said that these companies are competing for talent and the amenities and all the, you just listed a number of things that the user is looking for, because they view their workers as their capital assets that they want to preserve and protect and attract. What I'm seeing, and I know Kristin alluded to it earlier, which was the tech wave, where the address was important. Sun came to Burlington, Oracle came to Burlington, SAP came to Burlington. I mean, it was like, we want that address. You saw a little of that in Kendall Square. Everyone wants to have their presence in Kendall Square. What I'm seeing now is what you just alluded to, which is the amenities are important to attract, but the speed to putting what I refer to as a stake in the ground is critical. And those communities, it's not so much the address, I have to be in Burlington, I have to be in Chelmsford, I have to be in Lexington. It's how quickly can I get up and running in an environment that has those amenities. So for those municipal people on this webinar, I think what's important is to take a hard look at your rules and regulations and make sure that they reflect the current marketplace, because those decision makers are saying, we have a great idea, we have a great product, we have the venture capital to support us, but we have to move quickly. And we're going to look at a half dozen communities that have the attributes that you spoke about, but we have to be in rather rapidly in order to capitalize on our idea. And if you don't have the rules and regulations in place as a municipality, you're going to be off that short list. That's just
well, and Bob, to your point too, like if you don't have the space, you're not going to get them. And what we're trying to retrofit space, and as Scott, you said, there's a huge difference in building structure between an office building and a lab building. And what type of space do we have, and how do we begin to create that space, as you have with the Burlington Biocenter, and as well as what we did, simple things such as parking count. I mean, lab is huge space, but it doesn't have very many people in it. So we drastically reduced parking count, and we increased FAR. So you could have a bigger building. We know there's less people in it. You don't need to build the parking that you would for a traditional office. So, I mean, just those simple things, I think, starts to craft the availability of space that wasn't available before when you did the back of the napkin numbers.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting in all of this is the idea of, the office versus the lab space. And I think Burlington in some ways was not landing a lot of new lab space, in the early 2010s, teens, and places like Lexington were. And part of that may have been sort of the building stock. You had a lot more single story and maybe two-story buildings that had the clear height that's needed for building out lab space, because of all those benches that are talked about, lab benches, which require hoods and exhaust and a lot more depth to your or height in your structure to allow for the mechanical equipment to go in. And Sandhya, in terms of, I don't know how much history you have on Lexington, but in terms of the life science companies, and as Bob was saying, the importance of the address, the Cambridge and Kendall Square address, how important was that, certainly from companies you were speaking to, and the idea of locating, from their perspective, if you're unfamiliar with Boston, you're not a native, and you look at the area in Lexington or Burlington or Tewksbury is within that proximity to Boston that is reasonable and acceptable.
So the proximity is definitely, it was one of the reasons, that was stated in most of the thing, that the proximity, the cost of building. So for example, a square feet in Lexington would be anywhere between $36 to $40, whereas if you go towards Cambridge, I think it's around 89 to 95 per square feet. The latest numbers, you can find latest numbers anywhere in the report. But the thing is, that was the other factor that we would suggest, that the same space area that you're looking for in Cambridge is available in such a short drive, and you can find the same talent pool. And talent, Jay, you're absolutely right on that point. When it comes to life sciences industry, talent matters the most. More than the space, it's the talent. It's how you can attract the talent. Do you have the talent pool right for that kind of a job? And there's a lot of competition when it comes to retaining the talent. So those are the other things that we try to address when in Lexington as well. For instance, we now have food halls. We have 2 food halls opening in Lexington, especially in the Hartwell area, because that has become the life sciences corridor in Lexington. And things like amenities, we have bike trails. Most of these talent pools, they compare it with Cambridge, you know, how easy it is for me to ride the bike to my office. So we have bike trails. We have other areas where you can go out and have a stroll. So things like that are also attracting a lot of life sciences companies to the outer corridor. Address-wise, I would say that early startups are the ones that need the address. Because the rest of the companies that, you know, my previous employer and one of my very good friends, he used to say, we have krills and we have the sharks, and then we have the fishes in the pond. And the thing is, the krills were the R&D lab companies that we had, and the fishes just followed them, and the sharks came to actually look at all the innovation that was happening in the pond, and the sharks followed them in the 90s. And that's what has made the life sciences cluster in Cambridge and Boston. It's a similar scenario here. We are not trying to attract just the R&D companies that are graduating towards the clinical trials that you were mentioning, towards clinical manufacturing, but we are also trying to attract companies that are in the phase 2 or phase 3. I kind of built a grid structure when I was in my previous job about, you know, the right kind of companies that are looking at growth, but in a growth scenario, which is like 10,000 to 20,000 square feet, not, or maybe maximum 30 to 50, because you are not going to find companies anymore that are looking for 100 and 150,000 square feet anymore. Commercial manufacturing for or commercial biomanufacturing, the way we used to know, is no longer existing. There's more batch manufacturing, there's more technology involved in all these manufacturing. The industry is going towards cell and gene therapy and precision medicine. So I think it's more going towards 50-50 lab and 50 office space, but at the same time, recruiting more data scientists and recruiting more data talent, data analysts. So having, to Kristin's point, having those kind of technology-oriented companies like Oracle and Sun Microsystems or iRobot, all these parts really matter. And I'm super excited for Northeastern coming to Burlington, because now they have the robotics as well as you know, the AI arm in it, and as well as they have the experience and the expertise in the life sciences industry. So we now can absolutely say that we have the talent pool to also attract companies, biopharma and biotech companies to this region.
You know, and another thing that, and I think that's critical. Another thing, I think, Scott, I think you were the first one in town in this area to do it, is to get almost like a generic permit, so that you go to the marketplace with a permit for the structure, the building, or whatever, or the use that has not identified the user. There are protections built into that permit, but to me, it's critical to go to the marketplace with something in hand saying, we can get you in and get you operating within, you know, 6, 9, 12 months. And we've shortened that time period, which requires the municipalities to think differently. And, you know, we're at a period of time right now where the world around us is changing so fast. I mean, I made a comment the other day, in the last 90 days, we have changed the way we do work so dramatically that we're not going back. So the people who are making the decisions have to catch up. Otherwise, they're going to be left behind. We talked the other day. We talked the other day about just something as simple as rooftop mechanicals. If you want to attract this type of business, you can't limit the amount of rooftop mechanicals that go on top of a building, because some of the sophistication of these labs require separate air handling systems, et cetera. But a lot of the regulations and a lot of the communities do, and that is a killer.
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw in, you're right about the rooftop and the height limits that go along with that, because you could almost, for anybody not familiar, you can identify most life science buildings just by looking at the roofs as you drive by. And the ones that have an abundance of mechanical equipment on the roof are typically your life science buildings. But to talk, just to touch on something or follow up on what Sandhya said about the different types of life science biotech industry that's there now. I know from our experience and what we've seen, in the past, it was a lot of chemistry-based medicines that were being developed, very high volume, large manufacturing facilities when they did develop the medicine. And now, as you talked about, it's a lot more precision-based. It's a lot more biologics, as they talk about it. The way it was described to me at one point in time was it's almost like a brewery. You got big tanks where they're growing your bacterias and whatever it is that these very smart, well-paid people do in these facilities. But it's a very different type of medicine that's being developed now, the rDNA, RNA work, as well as this, which is all part of the biologics.
Yeah.
And different medicine for me than it would be for each of you leads to these small batch processing and these smaller manufacturing facilities, I know very often referred to as GMP. Those needs are going to be changing, especially in the world we're living in now, where there's certainly a drive to have these medicines manufactured close or within the US borders and not internationally necessarily, and certainly with the pandemic made close to where you will need them. How do you see that affecting what the industry is doing and where it's moving? And maybe Jay, throw that to you, and then Sandhya, if you could follow up too.
Well, what we typically see in our industry is, and getting back to Robert's comment, is the turnaround time on most labs from inception, once you pick your site, you're looking at about 3 years to turn these things around. And every part of that, if you can improve that in any way, obviously it brings things to the market a lot quicker. But on average, it's a 3-year turnaround from the time you select the site to the time we get the architects, the engineers, everybody involved, do a couple rounds of pricing, and then we start the execution, the actual construction, turnover, FF&E, you're about 3 years. So what we're seeing coming down the road is a lot of commercial realtors identifying space in every town around 128 right now to know what the inventory is, because some of these buildings, as we've talked about, won't support life science, but others will right off the get-go. That's going to speed up your 3-year turnaround dramatically. If I have your building, for instance, Scott, I can go in there in day one. I don't have to do a lot to change it if it's already been prepped, as you know. So a lot of these realtors are looking around for what's available. So when a client approaches them, it's ready to go. And what we're seeing is a lot more of what you talked about, these craft beer, they call them craft beer type medications. And what you're seeing is they may not be inventing new medications, but they're doing what Microsoft does. They're value adding to an existing. So it works great for Scott or Bob or Kristin or Sandra. And that's what they're doing. They need a much smaller plant. So now we're talking about 20 to 40,000 square feet, right? And when you're talking to these bigger commercial real estate agents, they've set up groups of people who are just doing the smaller projects, and then they have separate groups doing the larger, bigger projects. So they know it's coming, and what we're seeing is a lot of interest in smaller areas, maybe parts of buildings. But again, that building has to be supportive because as we all know, if you're going to do a lab, just right off the get-go, the electrical requirements are 5 times what they are for commercial office. So it doesn't always work. It's not to say we can't make it work, but again, it's going to add to that 3-year turnaround or keep it at 3 years if we don't have the infrastructure to support the lab day one.
Jay, can I ask a
Couple
question?
of thoughts. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob.
So couple of thoughts on what Jay just mentioned about the turnaround. One thing we need to keep in mind that these life sciences companies work on a very tight timeline based upon the FDA approval that they need to progress from phase 1 to phase 2. And the funding that they receive from VCs or they fundraise from other resources also depends on that timeline. So when they are expanding and asking for more funding, if the turnaround is affected by the cost issues or the construction issues that we are talking about, it exponentially hurts the timeline that they are working on, and it affects the FDA regulations and the approvals that they are working on. So having a generic speculative kind of a lab office space has definitely reduced a lot of this turnaround. And this actually started back in 1990s when they started Lab Central, and when they started having accelerators and incubators, which are ready for these R&D companies to hit the ground as soon as they start. And we are seeing a similar kind of a wave when it comes to construction for these phase 2 companies that are looking for lab office space kind of a construction that can immediately accommodate these folks and get them the funding that they are looking for, and also keep them on track when it comes to clinical trials.
Jay, what I want to follow up on, I've had some inquiries in the last 5-6 months, and I think Scott alluded to it earlier too, about a lot of the building stock is not suitable for retrofitting for lab space, except some people have started to focus on the top floors of 2- or 3-story buildings, because the top floor allows you some flexibility to put a lab in and do the required air handling or whatever you have to do, but it's limited to the top floor. Because I've had inquiries, so for instance 129 in Chelmsford has a lot of that. The Kronos used to be that 2-story, 3-story stock that people have said the top floor may be able to be retrofitted to accommodate lab space. I mean, have you seen that, or can you comment on that?
I would say this, it's probably the easiest floor if you're going to do one in a building, especially if it's, a occupied building. It may be a lot easier to actually add the equipment, reinforce the steel to get some of the rooftop equipment you need on it. Doesn't necessarily mean you can, but also what we're seeing is sometimes some of that equipment's going to be on the ground, especially if it's not a particularly tall building. So if you have some real estate that you could mount chillers and such, it's more piping, but at least you're not getting into heavy structural component changes. So sometimes we've come across where they actually were putting this stuff adjacent to the building if there's space, but always difficult. And the biggest part of renovation, as you folks know, is you got to be nice to your neighbor. So if you're in an occupied building, it's a much different construction project or renovation project than if the building is not occupied. It's a whole different ballgame.
And that ties into the earlier comment where the municipalities have to make sure that they're staying up on their regulations to permit ground-mounted infrastructure and other things that facilitate the introduction of this business or industry into their community.
Yeah, you got to be lab friendly, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, MassBio has a set of parameters that they've developed of how if your community is lab friendly or not. I would definitely suggest that if you have not already done that with permitting, processing, and zoning, I would definitely recommend that you go on the website and look at all the parameters that you need to get to a point that you're, lab readiness or bio ready for that community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. In terms of if you're not familiar with and haven't looked at, go to the MassBio website. They do have a bio-ready communities list. If you're not already on that, you need to be on that if you want to attract this business. You guys raised a point, Bob and Jay, about the equipment. The equipment is far more extensive than your typical office space, so you do have to make plans both physically as a property owner, but also regulation-wise. There are a couple of questions that came in, and Kristin, maybe you want to talk about this because the town's done a lot in Burlington recently to make itself more attractive to life science companies. And what are some of those changes that you made? And how do you get over the hump of becoming a more attractive life science company location?
Well, the first thing you do, I think, I know a lot of you on this call and, eat life science for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and thinking about life science and all that it is. But life science is radically different than it was 20 years ago. And to assume that the general population knows kind of how different and how much, there's a massive amount of regulation around life science from a state and federal perspective outside of anything we do locally. So I think there's a huge, you need to educate communities and community leaders as to what is life science now, what are we really looking at, and that just to really get a comfort level of what it is. And what it is a highly regulated, I think we had panelists before we had the zoning change from Northeastern, as well as some local folks that were town meeting members that were involved in life science, a member of our Board of Health, who really understood it, but to have the local community members explain to the community what this was and how safe life science is. That someone said it, they're safer in a life science building than they are in their own garage, in terms of what's around there. So I think that was really important. To get a comfort level, because everything about moving forward regulation in communities is a comfort level and to identify an appropriate level of control. And if you can do that, then you can allow potentially more flexibility, more pre-permitting, more, get readiness. But you have to provide that comfort level, and the comfort level requires education. And then regulation to control what this is. And what it is a very safe, highly regulated industry that has a very low impact in trip generation. Not many people in buildings. So really, you break it all down and the impacts are low. It's so much investment in this industry. It's excellent thing to diversify a space in any community. And therefore, the things we did were 1, educate, 2, better define life science in our bylaw, 3, work with the Board of Health to make sure the Board of Health regulations and the zoning regulations were a seamless process, and define who did what, as well as increase FAR to 0.5 for life science and lab buildings with that had buildings that had part lab. You didn't have the whole lab. It didn't have to be all lab. And then reduce parking to one parking space per 1,000 square feet. So, seemingly simple changes, but I think really if you can think about what we were talking about in terms of life science and biotech and what was in the movie theaters 20 years ago, it's very different than what it is now. And I think you really just need to get over that and kind of just get people's minds in the right place to move forward and embrace the industry. And I've only been to a few town meetings in my life where I've got unanimous votes, and this was one of them, and the town was very supportive.
How'd you do that?
Yeah, almost unanimous. I think there's always a no, but anyway, it was a big campaign. And I think people realized how important this industry was, and I think and hope that we really understood, with the help of a lot of you on this call, to help us explain what the industry was to the people who needed to make those decisions.
And just to pick up on what Kristin said, it sounds like a lot of regulation. It's one of the only industries where there's there's layers of regulation, but the users, when they see that, I think they get comfortable as long as they're rational regulations, because I think the user says, they understand my business. It's not going to be an emotional response. They understand what we do, how we do it, and we're not afraid of the regulations because we probably have more internal regulations than the municipalities have. But what they want to make sure is that you understand their business, because they don't want to be stopped or slowed down because of some ridiculous non-relevant issue that comes up. To show the user that you understand what they do, I think accomplishes a lot.
Well, as Sandhya mentioned, that the you have all this regulation, you have the venture funding, you have the FDA approval. By the time they show up in the municipality, they've gone through so many layers of regulation, and local permitting is not, anything that I think many people are well versed in, especially these innovative, these innovation companies. So you guys play a huge part in kind of communicating and helping walk through that. And we're trying, at a local level, try to help move that process and explain
I must say last week was my first virtual town hall meeting, and we rezoned and we approved of one of the life sciences buildings, which is coming. It's a Greatland realty project, 170,000 square feet. It was so interesting to see how much education that you just mentioned plays a part when it comes to regulation and zoning and things. My perspective was mostly from the consultant part, being on the other side and dealing with people who are building those structures. But the education piece, not just the town folks, the municipality folks, but also the people who are living next to the building that is coming up. Maybe it's a shopping complex, and letting them know what this exactly means in the future. Things like that. Education is number one when it comes to getting the zoning and the permitting process, getting it done easy, faster, and quicker.
Right, but and having cool things in your community and housing for all of these
housing.
Workers.
Let's not forget housing.
Yeah.
The time police just came.
Yeah, I see that. And I had the best question coming. No.
If you want to ask one more question, feel free, because this is a great conversation as well, too.
I think the education component and getting the municipalities ready for life science is very important, and getting that process. But as Jay was talking about, and we've talked about, the very long process to get from research to drug production. Can be a very, very long time to bring these buildings forward. And a lot of these companies have NIH funding or venture-backed funding or both, and they're not your major corporate names that you're talking about. They hope to be that name that of some year in the future as you're taking their medicine. But that presents a challenge in getting projects and space ready in advance. Bob, I just want to throw this out to you from a financing perspective. I know the challenges that we've faced on projects we've had. How do you see the finance industry, the banks, the lenders, equity groups? How do you see that changing as we go forward to be able to support these projects? Because it's been a challenge in the past when you go to build a facility.
Yeah, it has been a challenge in the past, but going forward, I think that probably for the next decade, office is not going to be the strongest driver of commercial real estate. But life science, logistics, manufacturing are three components. So lenders and oftentimes a biotech or a life science company comes to the plate with some serious venture funds behind them. I think that there's going to be a more permissive look at it because it is a growth industry. The credit underwriting, at least right now, is probably going to be tight because we're in a difficult period. But I do see it as a growth industry where it's moving at such a rapid speed. And I don't know if it was you, Scott, or Jay, or someone made the comment that it's recombination of existing therapies and medications as someone said, like Microsoft, value added. So that has a lower risk quotient than a novel experimental treatment. That's not to say those aren't going to play a role, but I see that if lenders are going to put their money somewhere, which they have to do in order to survive themselves, that this is a growth industry. And to end this, I think the whole purpose of this webinar, this is one of the only areas right now that there's a lot of activity and a lot of people out there looking, realizing that this is a growth industry. And if they can put their stake in the ground now and start the process, they are going to capitalize on it. So, you know, other segments of the industry or the economy are struggling, trying to figure out what the way forward is. But I do think that life science, and I call it advanced manufacturing, because we're never going to be in the same position we were in the past, where we had to rely on third parties for our supply chain. You know, and the typical American psyche is if we need 1 year supply going forward, we're going to have 3. So, you know, we're not going to be caught in this situation again, and it's moving extremely fast. So for those who are interested, where is the industry? I think it's growing, and I think that with the academic institutions in this area, at least, between the University of Lowell and the Boston schools, the hospitals, and the footprint that the industry already has out here, which a lot of people don't understand. It's a pretty extensive size of a footprint out here, that this is going to be a hot market. So I'll end there because I see Stephanie getting real nervous.
Yeah,
Just trying to keep on time.
right. It is definitely a growth industry, much more so as we have that uncertainty of where office is going as we go forward. There's been continued interest and activity on life science. I know we're looking at several projects right now that have continued to advance even during the pandemic. So I think that's a really important sign. So with that, thank you all for.
The only other problem is that they have so many choices now, they're slowing down the process because they're saying, should I go here? Should I go there?
So I don't want to end the conversation, but I do want to move it offline because I know that there are other questions. People, there's a lot that you guys have brought up that I think will spur a lot more conversation. So so really 3 things that I do want to do. First, Rick Kaplan, if you can help me to thank our panel and our moderator. I appreciate all the information.
I don't know if I'm on board with the video, yeah, but I want to also thank the panel. They did an excellent job, very informative. And I also want to thank all of our sponsors as well. Before we get into the questions, our corporate sponsors are Reamer and Bronstein, BSC Group, Mogul Architects. Vendor sponsors are National Grid, EBI Consulting, Merlin Construction, and US Pavement. And also I'd like to thank the Middlesex 3 Coalition. And now go to our questions.
So I'll thank the New England Real Estate Journal as well too, and again, thank you to our panel and our sponsors and our moderator. A lot of great information. A few things that I do want to throw out there is one, we would like to move this to more of a meet the panel or more discussion as far as just to continue the conversation. So if you have more questions, if you'd like to come back on screen and to kind of have a virtual networking conversation, just raise your hand on the bar below and we'll move all the attendees to participants and we can have continue the dialogue. If not, we will be sending out information to everybody who's registered with the information that was in the chat box, which includes website information as well as contact information, just to continue the conversations and keep networking that way. We do have another event next week as well too.